shall know him, I shall know him by the print of the nails in his hand. I shall know him, I shall know him, and redeemed by his side I shall stand. I shall know him by the print of the nails in his hand.
We're talking to you today about the believer's ascent. Well, sometimes it's called the rapture. Other times it's called an upgathering. In some interpretations of the Greek, it would be called the church being snatched away or believers being snatched away. There's many ways to say it. We're going to be looking at initially the 1st to 5th century, then we'll go on to 6th and 12th and so forth. But I want to read to you John 14, which I think is important for us to realize that this whole series of historical studies and these biographical studies that I'm giving you is based on people reading the scriptures and coming to conclusions. Let not your heart be troubled, Jesus said. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And we want to look at the fact that these scriptures that we'll be reading throughout the series, believers down through history to reconsider how they looked at the coming of the Lord, because they expected him to come at any time. I mean, literally any time. The idea of an imminent return of Christ was not a question. They didn't expect to die. They thought he would come before they died, because he said, that he would return. So he said it to them. They assumed that he was going to return to them. So we're going to look at the rapture in the history of the church now. And I want to say there are those who reject the concept of a rapture, and they make any number of false claims or accusations. One common one that probably instigated this study is the belief on the part of some that the rapture is only a recent invention of maybe J.N. Darby. But another false but popular false and discouraging accusation was by the Roman Catholics. And I talked about that in my previous talk, so I won't go into it in great detail. But basically, they heard the word rapture. They knew the Gnostics believed in a spiritual ascent of their spirits, and they decided they didn't like the Bible-believing Christians and the separatists, as they were called in that day, so they accused them of being Gnostics. But they clearly misunderstood. Gnostics, such as Valentians, the 2nd century, were described by Irenaeus as believing in a spiritual ascent of their pneumatics, or their spiritual elect. That's totally another subject, has nothing to do with what the scriptures teach. And the scriptures teach about the fact that we believers will bodily be resurrected, and those who are in the grave will be taken from the grave and will all be snatched up in glorified bodies and will meet Christ in the air. Totally another idea. Further, we know that the Gnostics rejected the idea of Christ even having a body, or that any believer would ever go into heaven with a body, because they considered matter evil. Well, anyway, let's move past the pneumatics and the false accusations of these people. Their philosophy was built on dualistic, Platonistic, and Zoroastric philosophies. Had nothing to do with Jesus or the Bible, though they loved to integrate and borrow and use verses they thought might prove their theories or support their theories. But the idea of the rapture event and the millennial kingdom, and yes, of course, the tribulation in between, were Bible truths that from the 3rd to 5th centuries were increasingly rejected by the Syrian and Greek Eastern and the Roman Western forms of Catholicism. Now, there were some exceptions, but these outliers were usually declared to be heretics, these separatists, by the Catholics, of course, that were forming every century into a stronger monolithic organization. Catholicism's opposition to all separatist congregations or any types of spurious groups or break-off groups was really a strategy of defamation and a program of persecution focused on all individuals and families who might be aligned with or members of these Bible-believing congregations or not. The first 8 centuries of Catholic historiography and historiographic philosophy pictures Catholicism as, in Catholics' own opinion, the only repository of final and unchanging truth. So anything outside of the Catholic Church was just wrong. It was that simple. And that continues to this day a general belief of Catholicism. Now, in the 2nd century, among the early metropolitan city pastors, men such as Clement of Rome or Ignatius directly addressed John 14, 2-3, and 1 Corinthians 15, 51-52, in a pre-tribulational context. Their writings focus much more on Christ's imminent return and the believer's moral preparation to be prepared for him to come. They did give some emphasis on Christ's return to establish a literal kingdom on earth and the gathering of the saints. But they weren't always clear on the tribulation, and things were very difficult at that time, and it was a popular opinion that the tribulation might already have started, and that the rapture would be in the middle of the tribulation or at the end of the tribulation, even though the scriptures were very clear that Christians would not go through the tribulation. But when you were there and the tribulation was going on, well, Justin Martyr, example, circa 100 to 165, was an early Western bishop or pastor. And he accepted a millennial kingdom, or what is sometimes called Chiliasm. And it was based on his reading 1 Thessalonians 4, 16-17, with the view that the saints will be caught up to meet the Lord. Justin, not Justin Martyr, but a historiographer of the same era, held a chiliastic or a literal millennial kingdom view, and he expected a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. He saw 1 Thessalonians as believers being gathered, but his emphasis on resurrection aligns with a physical gathering, although he did not place this clearly in terms of pre or post-trib. He didn't write on that. Irenaeus cites 1 Thessalonians 4:17 alongside Acts 1:11, describing believers being caught up in the clouds to meet Christ at his return with a trumpet call. You can't get much more direct and clear than that. Hippolytus of Rome, 170-235, Hippolytus connects 1 Thessalonians 4:17, Acts 1:11, describing believers being caught up in the clouds to meet Christ at his coming, with a trumpet, of course. Now, in the late 2nd century, the Montanists came along. According to Epiphanes of Salamis, who wrote much later about them, Montanists, he said, emphasized prophetic visions tied to Revelation 4, thinking they were having visions somewhat like John, and its trumpet-like voice. And they implied a spiritual gathering of believers to Christ as well, but they were quite confused, and frankly, our records of them is very fragmentary, and most of what we read are people who are quoting other people. So it's a little bit hard. The Montanists, according to John of Damascus, who wrote from 676 onwards, I think, about that time, maybe 700, are described as an early sect, and that's probably correct, who were active in the 2nd century. He notes their emphasis on prophetic visions and spiritual ascents, but again, it's very hard to know whether these accusations of having ecstatic experiences. When he wrote 600 years later or 500 years later, and certainly was not there. So his information, like much of the information available, had filtered through Catholic strategy of defaming these people. And so it's very hard to say what they really believe. But they did believe in a spiritual upgathering of the faithful to Christ. And their fragmentary texts are really difficult to follow, but their apocalyptic views loosely align with 1 Thessalonians 4:17 and the idea of being caught up to meet Christ. They viewed the scriptures as teaching an expectancy of Christ's return in the clouds as a literal, glorious descent of believers at the end of time. Well, I won't defend the Montanist view because I'm pretty sure it was filled with an awful lot of other error. Let me move on to Tertullian in the 3rd century. In 160 to 220, about circa 210, Tertullian writes and connects 1 Thessalonians 4:17 with Acts 1:11 again, by describing believers being caught up to meet Christ in the air at his return with a trumpet, signaling the event. And Tertullian stated that believers will be caught up to meet Christ in the air at his return, heralding this whole event. Now, writers like Irenaeus and Tertullian cited 1 Thessalonians 4:17 to often mistakenly describe believers meeting Christ in the air at his second coming. They hadn't yet placed the tribulation in its right order. They got confused. They believed in the millennial kingdom, but they got confused, and some of it was because the Latin Vulgate they were using emphasized this idea of being snatched up into the air, but it was not as clear as some of the translations that came along later. Due to the ongoing period of persecution of that time, you have to understand all Christian writers at that time really didn't know what to think of the tribulation and awaiting Christ's return. Most of them pretty well thought they were in some sort of tribulation because they were, and they were suffering. And was this the Great Tribulation? Well, they didn't argue it one way or the other. Victorinus of Poitou, born 230, died 304, was a Western bishop. He was a prolific writer and a commentator. He discussed Revelation 3:10, 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, and brought them together in a literal approach to scriptural interpretation. He referred to the faithful as those who would be kept from the hour of great trial and tribulation. Now, you have to understand, they were in great trial and tribulation, but he said, no, that's a greater one that is a prophetic one in the future. And Victorinus held a clear millennial or so-called chiliastic view. Again, he taught that believers or the church would be protected from the tribulation, as I've already pointed out, and he suggested the saints, or those spiritually alive in Christ, at the time of this event would undergo a physical and glorious removal. Ephraim, the Syrian, on or about 360, Ephraim wrote, linking Acts 1:11, 1 Thessalonians 4:17 also, stating believers will be caught up in the clouds to meet Christ. That's pretty clear. With accompanying trumpets and addressing the matter in literal terms, not some spiritual event that's Gnostic or something like that. In the 4th century, Cyril of Jerusalem, living from 313 to 386, in his circa 350 lecture number 15, ties Acts 1:11 and 1 Thessalonians 4:17 to believers being caught up in the clouds to meet Christ at his return, with the trumpet signaling the event. Now, for the sake of time, let me move to the 5th century and talk to you about Jerome. Now, from 347 to 420, the world was blessed with the Western monk Jerome. He was a historiographer, so one of my heroes. As a passage, he focused on 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17, Revelation 3:10, but he looked at all the verses. And he said, saints meet Christ, protected from wrath. And as a monastic scholar, he interpreted 1 Thessalonians as believers being gathered at a return of Christ, and he saw Christ protecting them from the tribulation, but maybe not all of them. He wasn't sure about that. Jerome taught that the saints meet Christ, protected from any serious wrath, so there's no payment of sins during the tribulation. At times he would lean toward an amillennial position in some of his writings, but then he'd swing back and say no. Caesarius of Aries, 470 to 542, in his circa 510 writing, he briefly mentions Acts 1:11, and he describes Christ's return as a visible event in the clouds. By the end of the 5th century, only separatist congregations and strongly independent preachers were maintaining a belief in the upgathering of the saints as being a literal event. Things changed. We could thank the false teaching of Augustine and some other things, but we'll leave that for another time. In our next video, we'll deal with the 6th to 12th century, but I'll stop at this time.
I shall know